Welcome, and thank you for joining our first YouthPower Learning webinar to share our perspectives on positive youth development. I am Cassandra Jesse, Director of YouthPower Learning, representing Making Sense International and the International Center for Research on Women. I will be moderating our discussion this morning. Today, George Patton, Kristin Brady, and I are discussing perspectives on positive youth development, or PYD, particularly in the international development context. We are going to cover adolescent and youth development, discuss positive youth development, and how to apply PYD in practice. But before we get started, I would like to share just a little bit about USAID's YouthPower and YouthPower Learning in particular. YouthPower includes two complementary USAID agency-wide global contracts, YouthPower Implementation and YouthPower Evidence and Evaluation. These contracts are mutually reinforcing activities. Task orders under each learn from and integrate the experiences of others. YouthPower helps make real the 2012 USAID Youth and Development Policy. As a whole, YouthPower supports an integrated cross-sectoral PYD approach to youth development. YouthPower Learning is the first task order under the Evidence and Evaluation arm, which is led by Making Sense International. YouthPower Action is the first task order under the Implementation arm, which is led by FHI 360. The purpose of YouthPower Learning is to generate and disseminate knowledge about the implementation and impact of positive youth development and cross-sectoral approaches in the international context. We lead research, evaluations, and events designed to build the evidence base about PYD. We promote a culture of learning by hosting communities of practice and by disseminating technical products, tools, resources through our website, youthpower.org. The website is intended to be an central repository of shared learning, as well as a collaborative space for use by youth development stakeholders globally. We also provide evidence and evaluation support to USAID missions for youth assessments, evaluations, research, training, strategy and program design, and other technical assistance through field support buy-in options. Given the great interest in today's topics, we recognize the challenge of taking questions live. As an alternative, we asked you as our audience to submit questions earlier this week. Thank you to those who responded. We have used the questions to shape our presentation and have synthesized some discussion by our speakers. At the end of the event, we will share additional ways you can engage YouthPower Learning and join our global discussion about PYD. Today I'm joined by two experts in positive youth development, Dr. George Patton from the University of Melbourne and a partner with us on YouthPower Learning, and Kristin Brady, the Director of YouthPower Action at FHI 360. Since our audience can read your bios, I'd rather ask you to share more about your personal experience with PYD. Even though positive youth development has been more recently codified as a field, likely all of us have some experience with the concepts of positive youth development. Many of us engaged in youth development have likely seen it or even done it in practice before we ever learned the term. George and Kristin, reflecting on your personal and work experience, what has shaped your journey to become a champion of positive youth development in your work?
Well, thanks, Cassandra. So, look, I guess it's both a personal and a professional for me. So, personally, I reflected back on what made a difference for me when I was in my teens. I was a teenage athlete, and I actually spent a lot of time. I was a middle distance runner. It meant that we spent a lot of time sort of with our teachers in that setting. And I had a particular teacher who we'd actually go on runs, as a group, and we'd go for 10 miles, 15 miles, and in that time we began to engage about what was happening in life, in my life. And I think that experience has really had a shaping effect on me and around the person I've become. But then I had a later experience around the Gatehouse Project, which is a project on positive youth development that we ran in Australia. And it was very much about making schools a better place for kids to live and learn and work. And we were talking to English teachers about how they interacted with students. And they'd often say to us, look, our students write essays, and those essays are about what is happening in their lives, their real world experiences, their families, with their friends. And the question from them was, should we engage? with them around the content of those essays. And I think that was a light bulb moment for me where I realized the opportunities that other professionals have to engage in a very positive and constructive, meaningful way with the lives of the young people they're interacting with. So those were two experiences that were important for me.
Fascinating.
That's great, and thank you, Cassandra and George. For me, I think interesting to reflect on George's experiences. I have two teenage daughters who are also runners and have had a very similar experience with their coach and the kinds of values and things they've learned from participating in cross country and track. For me, as I reflected back on my own experiences, I realized that I was experiencing positive youth development in my own high school experience. I went to a large traditional American high school, a place that could be quite lonely. And I was involved in an experimental program called the Alternative Learning Program. And this program really treated us as if we were college students. We had several free periods during the week. We had very high expectations for our academic success, and they gave us a lot of responsibility and freedom, indicating the level of high expectations they had and belief they had in us. And it was a place where individuality and creativity were honored and respected. And that wasn't always the case in the mainstream high school experience. One unique aspect of my experience was we had something called a journal, and we had a pal. One of our teachers was our pal, and we would write in our journal on a regular basis. The only person who would read our journal was our pal. And sometimes it was around creative writing and things that would really help us think through and explore different ways of writing, but a lot of times it was really to reflect on our own personal experiences in high school. And we knew that our pal was going to read and respond and treat us in confidence. And that safe space to build a healthy relationship with our teachers was a really important aspect of my high school experience. And I think for a lot of kids, it provided a different way to build their skills and capacities.
Interesting. Hearing a lot of themes coming through that I know we'll be talking about. We've got the senses of how do we build and connect, ensuring that there are relationships and somebody who is in particular your partner, your advocate and your champion to be able to be your partner in your journey. So we'll talk more about that as we're going on. But before we continue, I'd like to draw the audience's attention to the poll on the right side of the screen. We wanted to take a chance to learn a bit about your perspectives. So we asked two questions and would like to ask the audience to share responses to the first question now. What is the age range of youth with whom you usually work? And if you work with youth in several age ranges, select all that apply. We will leave the poll open as we discuss some of the key strategies for youth development and clarify terms about age. Then we'll close the poll and share the results. So George, please get us started this morning.
Look, thank you very much, Cassandra. So the title today is Perspectives on Positive Youth Development, and the perspective I bring is very much one from health, but thinking about health in an intersectoral space. My perspective is also a high-income country perspective, but it's one from outside the US as well, which I think is relevant. I want to start just with what has been happening sort of in the health field and thinking about development there. And I want to just quote from Richard Horton, who was the editor of the Lancet, who back in 2012 talked about adolescence and youth being the most pervasively neglected area of global health and international development. Now, that was back in 2012, and a lot has happened in that time. In 2012, USAID was really the first to recognize the importance of youth in development with the policy document that appeared later that year. And we've seen much happen in the last 3 years, which is very exciting. We've seen the global strategy for women's, children's, and now adolescents' health appear in 2015, which is a huge event for our field. I want to stress that it's also a challenge. It's an opportunity and a challenge. The challenge is that women's health has probably had 50 years of capacity building, younger children probably had 30 years, and adolescents and youth, relatively little investment in human capacity building. And that's why the Youth Power Initiative is so important. So today we wanted to we're having just a little, I think I've been responsible for this. Today we wanted to kick off and just clarify some terms, and if I can become more technically proficient. These are some of the terms that are used to describe this age group. So adolescence is often referred to that age group between 10 and 19. Youth is that age group between 15 and 24. Young people is a term that encompasses 10 to 24. And then we have these other terms, which you're likely to come across, ranging from early childhood, the under 5s, mid-childhood, 5 to 9, early adolescence, late adolescence, and young adulthood. Those are these technical terms that are used, and they're sometimes used interchangeably. And I think today, if we're referring to sort of adolescence or youth, we're actually referring to this youth power age group, which is 10 through to 29. Now, there are 3 questions we're going to be addressing today.
But before you get to those questions, actually, George, I want to go ahead and close our poll and actually ask both you and Kristin, while the poll is closing, what age groups do you largely work with?
Right, okay. Well, let me kick off. We started with 15 to 19 as the age group that we were most concerned about. And that was something to do with the health risks and social, the disruptive behaviors that are commonly apparent in that age group. But then we extended out into young adulthood. So we now work with an age group up to the age of 35 who are becoming parents in their own right. But we've also been very interested in what was happening before the age of 10 as well. So we also work with children down to around the age of 7. Kristin.
So my personal experience has been mostly with the 15 to 19-year-old age group. But our organization, which you'll see in the poll, is about 80% of our participants today have been working with this age group. Our organization works with all of these age ranges, as well as working with younger children as well, and adults in multiple sectors. But one of the things that I keep pointing out is that we need to begin to work with young people earlier. We know that young people are more vulnerable to risky behaviors in that 15 to 19-year-old range. And if we don't help them build their skills and knowledge to prepare for addressing those risk behaviors in the earlier years, we're going to continue to see some of those risky behaviors in the later years. So I think we need to be looking at the lifespan more broadly, and particularly looking at those younger adolescents.
Thank you. So these are the 3 questions we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at how has adolescence and youth development changed? What have we learned about adolescent and youth development? And what does positive youth development look like in practice? So I'd like to kick off with the first of those questions. And I'd like you to be thinking about this phase of life as one that has a biological beginning. And that biological beginning is puberty, marked in girls by the onset of menstruation or menarche, and marked in boys commonly by things like beginning to grow a beard or voices breaking. So that's the beginning of this phase of life, but it's been marked traditionally through sort of human development, through evolutionary development, by the transition to parenthood. Now this next slide shows what has happened in terms of youth development over the last 10,000 years. So if we actually go back to hunter-gatherer societies, these 2 events, the biological event of the transition to maturity, puberty, marked by the onset periods typically, was very much aligned with the transition to parenthood. The gap for girls was about 2 years. It was about 4 years for boys. That alignment continued all the way through until about 150 years ago in today's high-income countries, including the United States. And then a remarkable thing began to happen. We began to see a divergence between the biological event and the role transition to parenthood. By the mid-20th century, it was coming close to a decade. By the turn of the millennium, we were looking at a gap of almost 2 decades between the onset of reproductive maturity and having a first child. And in this phase, you can see that adolescence itself has emerged as a prominent phase of life. Indeed, today, in today's high-income countries, this is a more significant phase of life in terms of its duration than at any other point in human history. Now, that's been happening over the course of 150, 200 years in high-income countries, in low and middle-income countries. It's also happening. And these are the contexts in which the Youth Power Initiative is targeted. It's happening, but it's happening over a much shorter space of time. So we're talking about changes and the emergence of adolescence effectively over a couple of decades. Now, I want you to reflect on what the challenges are in that change. This is a cultural challenge. It's a challenge to the social systems in which families are raising adolescents, in which adolescents are growing up. It's a challenge to the service systems. And it is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to shape these according to the principles of positive youth development. And that's why positive youth development is now so important. Moving on to the second question, which is, what do we know about adolescent and youth development? Well, we have learned a tremendous amount about what is happening during these years in the last couple of decades. Much of this work comes from high-income countries, but it's applicable to young people growing up in low and middle-income settings. So firstly, I'd like to sort of ask you to reflect for a moment about, when does puberty begin? And I think when I ask this question to many audiences, they will say, well, it begins at around sort of 11, 12. That's the age at which it's happening. Well, many of you might be surprised to learn that the first biological changes of puberty are actually occurring when kids are in about grade 3. That's about the age of 7, 8. And this is a hormonal change which is related to the adrenal gland's maturation. The technical term is adrenarche. And this is something which shapes responses of a child to its social environment, the emerging adolescent, if you like. It's also something which shapes responses to stress. That's followed by events which include reproductive maturity or gonadal maturation. It's followed by a growth spurt. It's a bit earlier in girls than it is in boys. And it's also marked by shifting social affiliations. And this is possibly the most important part. Those of you who have had kids grow through puberty will know that relationships change. And this is biological. Parents, teachers, figures in authority tend to become pretty uncool. It's the peer group. And it's the external world. And in the modern context, it's the media, which becomes the focus and the social orientation of young people. And what is happening in that social world shapes development. And again, this speaks to the theme of positive youth development. I'll come back to the theme of the peer group, but the peer group becomes particularly important. And biologically, this is probably where, in terms of human evolution, one found one's mate. And those are the people who one parented with. And that was a task that was just around the corner in the evolutionary context. It's 20 years down the line in the modern context. We've also learned a huge amount about what's happening in brain development. We've learned about that this is a time of divergence in brain development. We know that with puberty, we see an upsurge of emotions. And this is maturation of those centers involved in emotional processing. Those centers involved in emotional control develop a little bit later. So what this opens up is an incredible window of opportunity and creativity. This is a phase of life in where mental and emotional function is at its most positive in a sense. But it also creates a window of vulnerability to a whole range of problems related to emotion and emotional control. These include problems such as mental health problems and substance abuse. They include risks for injury. They include risks for offending. They include risks around sexual and reproductive health. So what becomes important for kids in this age group is what we've called the social scaffold in which they're growing up. That is the context of families, communities, schools, the peer groups, which influence kids during this phase of life more than at any other. And this is the target for positive youth development. How do we build positive social scaffolds? We've also learned a lot about the social influences on adolescents and youth, and I've touched on this already briefly. And this is just to flag that this is a time in life where the diversity of social influences is greater than at any other point in the life course. It's a time of transition in social context. It's a time of transition in many countries to a family of one's own. It's a time of transition from education to employment. It's a time when the peer group is more important. And at this age, you spend more time with your peers and they're more influential than at any other point in the life course. It's also a time when what's happening in the broader social context matters a great deal. That's the economic context, the social and cultural context, the policy context, and the legal context in which young people are growing up. And I just want to point out that there's one that's particularly important, that's changing rapidly, which is the media context, and one that we really need to be concerned about in terms of positive youth development. 10 years ago, social media didn't exist. Today, it dominates the lives of youth. And finally, I'd just like to touch on how social context shapes identity. This is an age at which I mentioned the peer group is more important than at any other time of life. And I want you're essentially at this age competing with your peer group in forming your identity and your position in the social order, your social status. So I want you to reflect for a moment about this group of young Tibetan monks and what they're competing on. And they're competing around values of humility, piety, generosity. Those who can excel in achieving those values and those beliefs and behaviors that are related are the ones that have the highest social status. I want you to contrast that with this group of young men. So they're members of a Guatemalan gang. Here the values are macho, male values, aggression, violence, submission of women. Those values are shaping their identity in a very negative way, not only for themselves, but for young women and for their communities. Again, I want to stress, this is an age group where the peer group is crucially important. It's also an age where we can create opportunities for positive development. And we're going to be moving on to talking about those, but education and the opportunities of education for young women are one of the most stunning and most important opportunities that we can create. And there are also things that take those opportunities away, and early parenthood is one example of something that diminishes the life chances for young women. Now, at this point, we'll move on to the third question. I'm going to pass over to Kristin about what is important in how does positive youth development work in practice.
All right, now it's my mistake on technology. Okay, thanks, George. And this is a great introduction to talking more deeply about positive youth development. So, what is positive youth development? We've heard the term, we're all familiar with it, and I find that it's either something we grasp pretty quickly or it's something that really takes a while to fully understand all the aspects of it. So, PYD is both a philosophy and an approach. It's a way of understanding young people that helps us guide the design of our programs. And there are several research-based principles that are key to PYD. One is the focus on strengths and positive outcomes. In prior youth development approaches, there was a focus on deficits, focusing on single sector, narrowly focused approaches to prevent negative behaviors, such as teen pregnancy, smoking, drug or alcohol use. And we've learned that those kinds of approaches were not very effective. We needed to focus on building strengths and assets of young people rather than trying to prevent negative behaviors. We also learned that we needed to focus on the holistic needs of young people. Rather than simply focusing on a negative behavior, we needed to build young people's social, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive skills based on different stages of development. We need to also engage young people. Youth are valued partners who have meaningful decision-making roles in programs and communities. We work with young people, not for them. We must engage young people as partners, create adult-youth group partnerships, and listen to their experiences and perspectives. Traditional programs might have focused only on specific categories of young people, of at-risk youth or of gifted youth. And we know that positive youth development can impact all young people. However, we also know that in many cases we need to focus on target vulnerable youth, who are particularly at risk in our communities. PYD is more than a program that happens within the walls of a youth program. PYD is based on a socio-ecological model, and we've learned that young people's development is impacted by their peers, by their parents, by the communities, by the perceptions. Well, how do young people value youth? How do they interact with their community members? How are they seen by their teachers? Are they given respect or are they disregarded? So it's everybody's job to promote positive youth development. And positive youth development is not something that happens within a project sphere. It doesn't happen over a 3-month activity or a 9-month activity. It's something that should be happening throughout a young person's life and throughout the interactions they have in the communities where they live. So YouthPower Learning and USAID have developed a definition of PYD. And there are a number of definitions, but let's look briefly at this definition. And I want to highlight a number of key features in this definition. One, we're talking about engaging youth, families, communities, and governments. So we're looking at the broad range of actors that impact young people. We're looking at building assets. We're talking about fostering healthy relationships, whether it be a track coach or your teacher who serves as your pal. Strengthening the environment and transforming systems.
Before you continue, I'd like to draw the audience back to our polling question. We'd like to ask you to respond to the second polling question. What are the outcomes you are most concerned about for youth? And just like the last question, select all that apply. And again, we will close the poll and share the results at the end of the next slide.
So there's been a number of studies of positive youth development and a number of different frameworks that highlight different aspects of programs that promote positive youth development. And we've identified a number of key features that are relevant for the kinds of programs that we work with. And this builds on research that came out of the National Research Council and the National Academies of Science. So let's look at those features individually. First, let's talk about building assets. We've said that young people need to build strengths and focus on their assets. What are those kinds of assets? I think we immediately go to things like work readiness and preparing young people for work. But increasingly, we know the importance of building social and emotional skills. And it also refers to helping young people find their spark, identifying something they're passionate about and they can feel good about. It may not be that George is going to be a runner in life, but that activity gave him something to be passionate about, as well as building that positive relationship with his coach. And that's important for helping young people feel excited about something and build confidence in something. In terms of healthy relationships, we know that healthy relationships and positive role models are protective factors that support resilience and help youth build their own social skills. We hope that youth have at least one caring and constant adult in their life, but ideally have other positive role models that could be coaches, mentors, tutors, or even a neighbor. Belonging is really important during adolescence, as most youth are highly focused on their peers, as George talked about, and about building their own identity. We know that the desire for belonging can have negative impacts, as we saw with that gang member from Guatemala, and is increasingly attracting some youth to belong to extremist groups. Or it can have positive impacts, being part of your running team or a scouts group or a 4-H group or other programs that provide a positive sense of belonging, along with many of these other features that we're talking about. Youth programs should provide clear boundaries, clear expectations for what are positive pro-social behaviors. At the same time, having high expectations and positive perceptions of youth potential. We need to be engaging actors. A key feature of PYD programs is when young people are engaged as actors in their own development process rather merely as beneficiaries. Youth engagement creates better projects and policies while enabling youth to begin to build skills and connections to the communities. We know that youth can be a powerful change agent, and we need to provide them with voice and opportunity to contribute. Safe physical, psychological, and virtual spaces are important for youth. Psychological safety is particularly important to creating a sense of trust, which makes it easier for youth to build skills, particularly self-confidence and self-esteem. And finally, supporting youth within the walls of a youth program is not sufficient. Youth need access to other government programs. Their parents need to understand and be linked to those kinds of youth programs, so we can create a continuum of programs for young people, both inside a program as well as in their community, and help them access other types of important services.
All right, we are going to go ahead and close the poll now. Kristin, if you want to continue to talk about, I think you're going to get into a little bit more about outcomes, and if you can share with us what are some of the results of the poll.
So if we look at the poll, our participants are involved in a number of different types of sectors. The most common one here is in education. Second is health, followed by workforce development, and community or family engagement. So we've seen a wide variety of kinds of sectors that we're working in. And a high interest in gender-related programs as well. So what is some of the evidence around PYD? So in many programs, PYD is an approach to achieve one important objective, like focusing on crime and prevention. But it's actually been found to impact positively on other important youth outcomes, which are often not the target of an initial project. This means that PYD approaches have been found to impact multi-sector outcomes regardless of the original program goal. For example, crime prevention programs using a PYD approach have been shown to impact both academic skills enhancement and delay of sexual activity. This has been shown to be true regardless of youth gender or ethnic group.
Next, we wanted to talk through just some examples around putting PYD into practice. So we've been talking about the important elements of adolescent and brain and systems development, moving into what is positive youth development, and now we want to sort of see what does this mean in practice in a couple of examples.
Oh, thank you, Cassandra. I'll come in here. I mentioned the Gatehouse Project in English teachers earlier. This is a project which had a very high level of evaluation, so it's what's known as a cluster randomized trial evaluation of what was a trial of promoting a sense of connection and security and belonging to school. And the focus was very much kids of around the age of 13 and 14 in early high school. Now, this was a project where I want to show you what the conceptual framework looked like. So we had here a model where there were three things that we were wanting to promote. We were wanting to promote a sense of security at school, so a place where sort of younger adolescents felt safe. It was a place where they were communicating with the people who were important in that setting, the adults in that setting, yeah, obviously the teachers, but others working in the school as well. It was a place where they could communicate with their peers and communicate openly and without fear. It was a place where they were participating beyond simply doing the schoolwork. So that might have been participating in sports clubs, drama clubs, out-of-school programs. So it was very much about contributing to the life of the school. We focus very much here on creating opportunities. Schools are busy places, and for example, communicating with your teacher. If you're on a busy schedule and you're a teacher in a busy schedule where there is no time between classes, one needs to create the time for speaking and interacting. We needed to promote skills, and this was very much about promoting communication skills, not only for the students, but also for the teachers. The object of this exercise was, we believed that if we were to do this, we'd improve many things in the lives of these younger adolescents. We'd improve their learning outcomes, we'd improve their emotional well-being, and we'd reduce things like health risk behaviors. Yeah, in the process of doing this, we measured these elements of security, communication, participation. We asked students effectively, what was it like to be living and working at your school? So we asked about experiences of bullying, whether teachers noticed if you did a good job, where you were participating in school life. And those were the kinds of indicators, if you like, of positive youth development in that setting. I can tell you that this was a remarkably successful project. 4 years on, in these same schools, we saw reductions in substance use and abuse in 13 to 14-year-olds of about 30%. We saw similar reductions in socially disruptive behaviors, theft, interpersonal violence, property damage of a similar magnitude. And in 13-year-olds, we saw a 50% reduction in early sexual activity. It's an illustration of the power of a positive youth development approach. I'm going to turn you back to Kristin at this point, who's got another example, I think, from Mozambique.
So let's talk about Mozambique. We've been working with an approach, working with at-risk youth, for over a decade. And the program was first developed in northeastern Brazil, and it's called Programa para o Futuro, or PPF for short. It actually began as a program focused on at-risk youth to help them build ICT skills for employment. Over time, the program has evolved, and we began incorporating PYD elements, whether we realized it or not at the time. And we've adapted the program for orphan and vulnerable youth, ages 15 to 17 in Mozambique. As we adapted, it became a broader youth development program that addresses holistic needs of youth. So we use an integrated curriculum that builds basic literacy, ICT, work readiness skills, while also focusing on healthy behaviors, gender, addressing stigma, and financial literacy. We use a project-based learning methodology that's particularly effective at building soft skills that are important not just for work, but for their broader transition to adulthood. So one of the important elements is really creating a positive learning environment that helps create the kind of change we're looking to see. So this includes clear norms of behaviors, high expectations, and creating a safe, respectful, and supportive learning environment. One of the things that we spend a lot of time is identifying the most appropriate youth people to work in our staff. So before we hire staff, we observe how candidates interact with youth, because that relationship is one of the most important factors for success. In addition to these facilitators, we match youth with e-mentors so they can access another type of role model, a professional in the community. Our staff is multidisciplinary, and one of our facilitators is a social worker. This person supports all of the learning in the program, but also is there to help identify and support young people with specific psychosocial needs. So this environment of safety, of respect, of clear norms of behavior helps create a tremendous learning environment that is important to the kind of change that we see. We also involve young people in many aspects of the program. At a very basic level, they're involved in creating that safe space. They contribute to identifying the kinds of norms of behavior that are part of our culture in the classroom. And we engage them in all aspects of decision making. We're currently working with them to define our monitoring and evaluation program. But they also have worked with young people to help them contribute in their own communities. Young people identify 2 to 3 peers in their neighborhoods, and together with other PPF youth, they share what they learned during the weekend through Saturday morning activities where they try to replicate what they learned during the classroom. And as they graduate, they join PPF youth clubs, where they take on their own community service activities they define that help outreach with other students in schools and participate in other community activities. We also help young people access other important services. After they finish the 4.5-month program in the classroom, they go on to an internship or on to vocational training to help them continue that growth and build additional skills. We work with family members throughout this process. We have regular meetings with family members to help them understand the kind of transition young people are going through and how they can support those young people. We also work with community health workers that have been assigned to families of orphan and vulnerable children. And they help those young people access other government services that might be appropriate for them. And all of this has come, has had tremendous results. We see 98% completion rate, so the kids love this program. They come after they graduated. They really feel that PBS is a home for them. And we've tracked about 70% of the youth a year after completing the program, and 95% of those kids were still in school. And this is in a place where high school graduation is about 4% in the province we're working with. And 60% of those youth are working, about half of them in the formal sector, which is a pretty significant accomplishment for youth who come from the kinds of backgrounds that they come from.
Well, thank you, both of you. I wanted to ask you actually several questions. Some of these are questions that have come in from the audience. Some of these are questions that I've been thinking about while we're sitting here, and wanted to just take an opportunity to expand on the stream of discussion that we're having. So, Kristin, you mentioned earlier how PYD grew out of the frustration with earlier prevention activities that focused only on preventing negative behaviors and on specific at-risk youth. Those of us working internationally know the focus on prevention well, and we see programs that are talking about preventing early marriage, risky sexual behaviors, or that participation in violence. PYD, on the other hand, calls for holistic programming that builds positive assets that contribute to broader outcomes that may not be directly attributable to more narrow targets. So how do we go from thinking sectorally to thinking more holistically, which is required by a PYD approach? And what implications does this have for program implementation and evaluation?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about PYD is we saw the outcomes, whether you are single sector focused or not, the outcomes impact across multiple sectors. So PYD can be both sector agnostic and also supporting multiple sectors. It's cross-sectoral in terms of its impact. We did an interesting activity several weeks ago. We were developing a training program on PYD, and we looked at a number of different youth assessments. And we asked participants to identify the root causes of some of the issues that those youth assessments were focused on, such as youth violence or youth unemployment. And when they did the analysis, they found that the root causes of some of the problems they were trying to address were actually in other sectors. So we know we need to look at more than one sector to address some of those problems. And we also found that the problems were related to how young people were perceived. What kinds of supports were they bored? Were they active? Were they engaged? Did they feel that they had a place in their community? Did they feel their communities valued them? And so we realized the kinds of issues that young people were talking about in those youth assessments were really the kinds of things that PYD approaches address. So I think PYD is both supportive of multiple sectors and can be integrated in supporting cross-sector youth development.
I think there's some great points, Kristin. I think the model that we tend to think about is this model of the social scaffold, and it's a useful sort of metaphor to think about what are the elements that young people need in place as they're growing up. And that's going to be important, as you said, it's going to be important for their outcomes academically at school. It's going to be important in terms of their health and their emotional and social development. It's going to be important in terms of some of those tasks of transition to families of their own, becoming independent, becoming good citizens. So I think all of those elements that you've talked about are really important. Then in terms of how we do this, there are some good examples. I actually think the Gatehouse example is not a bad one. It was an example where we created a process within schools that actually brought, different elements within schools. So the people who deal with curriculum, the people who are the administrators, the people who deal with student welfare together. Also we had parents, we had students, young people sort of actually on the sort of action teams that we created. So having a structure, I think, is a really important part of implementing these programs. It's also important to have people come in from outside into sort of communities, into schools, into the settings in which you might be working with positive youth development. So in the Gatehouse project, we had a critical friend. It was somebody who knew schools, but was actually coming with a perspective beyond simply an education perspective. And they worked with the action teams. And that was an iterative cycle where we went back again, and we were talking about sort of indicators earlier, and we measured these indicators of progress in terms of whether kids were actually making progress and feeling safer, in their communication, in their participation. And it's the kind of model that works. And there are some really great examples here in the United States. The group in Seattle, at the Seattle Social Development Research Group, they're worth looking at in terms of some of the best developed models of implementation of positive youth development. And it's really bearing out what you said. If you look at programs such as the Seattle Social Development Project or Communities That Care, the outcomes that you see, they're not just outcomes in terms of things like substance use or offending. They're also around educational achievement. They're around health benefits. There are a whole range of interpersonal benefits, and benefits not only for the individual, but also for their families and communities. Worthwhile looking at. Great work.
Thank you. You know, we've been talking about the importance of youth engagement, but some of the challenges around that. I mean, we hear how youth voice and participation really can be antithetical to cultures that place so much greater emphasis on the contributions of older generations. And this makes meaningful youth participation a significant obstacle. How important is youth engagement in a PYD approach, and what are the challenges and opportunities of engaging youth in PYD programming?
Okay, well, maybe I'll kick off with this one. Look, Cassandra, it's essential. And it's not necessarily something that we've done particularly well, I think, in a whole lot of sectors. And I think there are sort of a range of barriers here. I think there are sort of attitudinal barriers. Well, sort of what would young people know is the kind of attitude that we see in some settings. And that's a particular challenge in sort of more traditional cultural settings. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done with community leaders in those settings to make youth participation work well. But young people, let me be very clear, they are the experts on what is happening in their lives and the lives of their friends and their peers. And if we don't talk to young people, our programs are effectively not anchored because we're not understanding the group who the programs are designed, we're not understanding their lives. Now, youth engagement doesn't happen just out of the blue. It's a sense that Kristin and I, we've had many decades in this field to learn the skills that we have. And we can sometimes assume that, well, if we just bring a young person into the room, into a webinar such as this, they'll be able to function. And that's nonsense. So we need, in terms of thinking about youth engagement, to be also thinking about the skills and supports that young people need. So to do youth engagement and participation and really empower young people, we should be resourcing them. We should be resourcing them with skills. We probably should be resourcing them financially for their participation and their time. We need to be partnering them with adults, and we need to be creating the systems at that community level or at other levels, but beyond the community, to allow and enable their engagement.
That's great, George. I think one of the things I want to point out is exactly that young people need time. We can't just bring them in to think that they can jump into leading a youth-led activity. One thing we can do is start gradually. Start with safe topics. Start with a lot of support. One thing we've had some success with is start engaging youth in research, in youth mapping, in having them analyze and collect data so they can start engaging in these issues and they can begin to understand themselves. And as they analyze and collect and present data, it helps adults see that young people have important stories to tell, they have important perspectives, and I think as we gradually support young people, give them the kinds of support and resources to let them build their own knowledge and come up with their own perspectives, they tell the story pretty well by themselves.
Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely right. And there are some great aids that have actually been developed to help young people sort of articulate what is happening in their lives. There's a package called Photo Voice, which some of you might have come across, but it's actually a fabulous way of assisting young people to tell the story of their lives and their communities and their families, their own lives, through visual images. And this is something that works incredibly well. It's empowering, and the photos effectively give voice to these young people to really tell and communicate with adults what is happening in ways that might otherwise be a bit difficult. They're also fabulous, the images, in terms of advocacy, and actually helping develop a more positive lens on what is happening in the lives of young people. Because I think sometimes the lens that we bring to youth, particularly in the media, is a very negative lens.
Yeah, we don't engage youth. Our programs are not anchored. And thank you for some of these strategies. I'm thinking both, ideas of photo voice. Earlier, you talked about journaling. You've talked about engaging youth as researchers, getting them on the ground as we are developing our programs. But it is a challenge and something that we need to do very conscientiously and deliberately. So research in the US, Australia, other developed countries really do suggest that PYD works. There is evidence at the developed country level. But there's still skepticism that PYD can work in developing countries. What evidence do we have to date that positive youth development approach is more effective? And what can we do as youth stakeholders to convince people, from donors to grassroots level youth serving organizations, to make this investment in a holistic PYD cross-sectoral approach? And what are the best methods for capturing the impact of PYD?
Wow, that's a big question.
The $1 million question.
If only we knew the answer to that question. Unfortunately, we have YouthPower Learning is going to have to figure that out.
Yeah, and that is part of our job, but I'd love to hear your insights.
Well, shall I kick off, Kristin? Look, the evidence that we have comes mostly from high-income countries, and really the United States has led the way in developing sort of models and evaluating positive youth development. And I think from a few other high-income countries, we also sort of have evidence that this works. And the Gatehouse Project that I described, or Seattle Social Development Project, they're fairly typical of where the evidence lies, and it's mostly for the mainstream. Probably where it's actually even more important, and by the mainstream, I'm talking about sort of youth who are trucking along reasonably well in their lives. We can improve their lives. Where we probably have less evidence is around youth who are disadvantaged. So coming into the adolescent years, with a background perhaps of poverty or from ethnic minority groups or otherwise socially marginalized. Young offenders are a good example of a group who sort of tend to be sort of in that marginal population. And we tend to have done less in terms of evaluating positive youth development in some of these socially marginalized groups. And yet I suspect that the benefits for those groups of positive youth development is even greater. We've tended to focus very much on the negatives, not on the positives of what is happening and what is possible in their lives. So we do have a challenge ahead. Positive youth development is something which needs to be embedded in the social, cultural, economic context and legal context in which it's you're going to be developing programs, and that's something where we cannot be assuming that a program from Australia or the UK or the United States is necessarily going to translate into Mozambique, South Africa, India, Pakistan. So this is something where there's a process, I think, of translation, testing out what might have worked elsewhere. And maybe it's not appropriate to sort of actually adapt a program from the United States to these other settings, and the work actually needs to happen from the ground up. As was the example, I think, Kristin, of your work in Mozambique.
Well, I think, if I think of the way we've looked at results and outcomes in Mozambique, we've been fairly traditional. We've looked at the outcomes. We've looked at school participation. We've looked about jobs. But the kinds of changes we see among young people, we have a hard time measuring. That tremendous boost in self-esteem, that development of agency, the ability to communicate with peers. We see dramatic changes with these young people over a period of really within several months. We see them moving from being passive and quiet, or perhaps angry or disruptive, to being incredibly positive, optimistic, energetic, and having a lot of confidence for what they can do. We are under YouthPower Action. We have been looking to identify what are those important social and emotional skills, soft skills, for workforce outcomes, for reducing violence, for preventing violent behaviors, and for enhancing sexual reproductive positive behaviors. And we're going to be looking at ways to measure those skills. What existing instruments are out there to measure those skills, and how can we adapt those instruments for use in developing countries so we can measure some of those skills across developing country contexts. So that's something that's coming from YouthPower Action.
There's a question here a little bit about language that comes up across the different languages that we use across different sectors. And I just want to pick you up on soft skills, because the soft skills are very much the same as some of the social and interpersonal skills that we actually know underpin sort of healthy development. They underpin learning as well. And this really comes back to the intersectoral value and the multiple dividends that you actually get from investment in positive youth development approaches. I also want to say those benefits actually extend beyond young people themselves. And just to sort of report a comment from the Gatehouse Project, where one of our sort of critical friends said the key change sort of actually happened in the teachers' room. So the sort of room that the teachers used, which in terms of the atmosphere and the ethos of what was happening there, the interactions between teachers, they also benefited from an intervention that was very much about promoting positive youth development.
And just to sort of add our own lens to this, I mean, this is a question that we here at YouthPower Learning are wrestling with as well. We're in the process of conducting a meta review and looking at how positive youth development approaches are being implemented across sectors in low and middle income countries specifically, and trying to understand what the evidence says about their effectiveness. So we're also trying to answer some of our own questions. Well, before we wrap up, I'd like to share a few announcements. Next week, we are officially launching our website, youthpower.org, but we are excited to share that the website is live now, if you want to take a sneak peek. We invite you to join the dialogue, contribute your resources, and foster a stronger youth development community. I also want to share about YouthPower Learning's grant under contract mechanism. These are grants that are used to support youth participation and enable organizations to help build the evidence about positive youth development. These grants are small. They're between $15,000 and $50,000 US. And we recently released a request for applications, which are due on March 30th. We are seeking applications in 2 thematic areas, youth engagement and in cross-cutting skills. So go to youthpower.org and learn more. And lastly, we here at YouthPower Learning are hosting 4 communities of practice. These 4 communities of practice are youth engagement, cross-sectoral skills, gender and positive youth development, and youth in peace and security. And communities of practice, or for short, COPs, are social networks that drive discovering promising practices in positive and cross-sectoral youth development. They're a forum for sharing resources and experiences among practitioners, researchers, youth leaders, and others concerned with engaging youth in the design, implementation, and evaluation of youth development programs. So we welcome you to join one or more of these COPs through our website, youthpower.org. So first, I want to extend a warm thank you to both George and Kristin for joining us today. Your insights have been invaluable as we all forge ahead in applying a positive youth development approach internationally. We also want to thank USAID, particularly Lori Rushton, Elizabeth Berard, and Calvin Robinson for their support in the development of this webinar. And thank you to all of you who joined us online. We look forward to continuing the discussion and learning through our learning network. Thank you and goodbye.